Jeb Bush says he is not going to the Republican National Convention this year. So if there was one last Republican somewhere in the country who was hoping that Jeb Bush would get drafted off the bleachers at the RNC and brought in to save the party at the last moment, turns out it's going to be at least a little more complicated than that, because Jeb Bush will not be in the room when the decision happens. He told CNN this afternoon that he is not going to attend the RNC. And CNN is billing this news as part of a larger story about how lots of prominent Republicans are maybe going to skip the Republican convention this summer, because it's basically a foregone conclusion that it's going to be a very controversial event. Either the party is going to pick a very controversial nominee for president, or the party is at least going to pick whoever its nominee is by some very controversial process. So even if they picked somebody who was the most anodyne candidate that they could imagine, the way they would get there would also be controversial, even if they don't pick one of their controversial candidates. So it's going to be controversial either way. The most risk-averse Republicans in the country are apparently planning on staying away from the Republican convention because of that, and that list apparently includes Jeb Bush. And so this is going to be an interesting factor to watch in terms of, Republican senators or Republican governors who are up for re-election this year, or Republican members of the House from swingy districts, right? Do they show up and participate in their party's big controversial event this summer, or do they stay home and try to pretend like their own re-elections are totally separate from that mess in Cleveland, and that they are totally separate from whoever their party puts at the top of the ticket? Right? So it's going to be interesting to watch for other Republicans who are running for things this year. But just the Jeb Bush factor itself strikes me as a historically significant development. Just because it has been a very, very long time in this country since the Bush family didn't play a key role, a central role, in choosing the presidential nominee of the Republican Party. It's just impossible to imagine a Republican National Convention without the Bush family there. I mean, in modern American politics, there have been 4 different recent Republican National Conventions where the party has picked a member of the Bush family as the Republican presidential contender for that year. That happened in 2004 and in 2000 and in 1992 and in 1988. Even when a Bush family member was not himself the nominee, the Bush family has still been intimately involved, absolutely integral, to deciding who else the party might pick if there was no suitable member of the Bush family available that year. Take, for example, 1964. 1964 was a year when George H.W. Bush's dad, so Poppy Bush's dad, Jeb and W's grandpa, Prescott Bush, in 1964, he played a significant role that year in this happening to the Republican Party. This is what happened on election night in November 1964, when the Republican nominee for president was Barry Goldwater. The states he carried represented in red here. Barry Goldwater got absolutely just lacquered, totally shellacked by the Democratic nominee Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And Barry Goldwater's landslide loss was something you could see coming. I mean, a lot of mainstream Republicans, lots of political observers of all stripes, definitely the whole Democratic Party, they could tell in advance that if the Republican Party nominated somebody like Barry Goldwater, his politics were so far to the right that the Republican Party that year would just fall off the edge of the electoral map. And they did. The reason, though, that avoidable political mistake happened, that foreseeable political error was nevertheless committed. The reason that happened in 1964 is because the so-called establishment choice for the Republican Party that year, the guy who was supposed to get the nomination that year, his campaign cratered. And the party ended up turning to Barry Goldwater once their Plan A ended. And Prescott Bush, Poppy Bush's dad, is part of the reason Plan A ended. Because the establishment choice that year, 1964, was this guy, the popular, telegenic, centrist, recently reelected zillionaire governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller. Prescott Bush and Nelson Rockefeller had a sort of similar pedigree. They had similar politics. Prescott Bush was a well-regarded, well-liked, moderate Republican senator from Connecticut who, among other things, had taken a principled stand against Republican Senator Joe McCarthy and his McCarthyite witch hunts. Prescott Bush had a good popular, high profile in the Republican Party, even after he left the Senate on his own terms in 1962 when he decided not to run for re-election. Prescott Bush was friends with Nelson Rockefeller. He'd wanted Nelson Rockefeller to be Nixon's running mate in 1960. Everybody assumed that Prescott Bush, of all people, would be all in for Nelson Rockefeller. As Nelson Rockefeller, the establishment choice, went for what was almost his inevitable nomination by the Republican Party in 1964. But then, what happened to blow it all up was that Nelson Rockefeller got divorced in 1962. And then even worse, unimaginably worse, the following year in 1963, Nelson Rockefeller got remarried. Oh no. And Senator Prescott Bush, this fellow Northeast establishment liberal Republican, he dropped his longtime friend Nelson Rockefeller like a hot rock. Prescott Bush gave a speech at a prep school graduation of all places where he just ripped his old friend Nelson Rockefeller up one side and down the other. He said, quote, "Have we come to a point in our life as a nation where the governor of a great state can desert a good wife, mother of his grown children, divorce her, then persuade a young mother of 4 youngsters to abandon her husband and their 4 children and marry the governor?" Now, this was the early 1960s. Was probably going to be some level of problem for Nelson Rockefeller either way, for him to get divorced and then remarried right before running for president, particularly when the woman who he married after he got divorced was a woman who herself had previously been married. Right? But what Prescott Bush did when he didn't just abandon his friend, he publicly excoriated his friend as a moral reprobate for what he had done. What happened when Prescott Bush made that break with Nelson Rockefeller? That made clear to everybody that there would be no cover from the moderate liberal wing of the Republican Party for what Nelson Rockefeller had done in his personal life. And the fact that there was going to be no cover for him in his own moderate liberal wing of the party, that, of course, made it, more quickly and more cleanly fatal for Nelson Rockefeller when the conservative wing of that party descended on him like locusts. The great Rick Perlstein wrote about this beautifully, actually, and with some incredible detail in his book, Before the Storm, which is the seminal modern book about the conservative movement in the Republican Party. Rick describes this scene where Nelson Rockefeller that year, after getting divorced and then remarried, he attended the convention of the National Federation of Republican Women. And he attended that event with his new wife on his arm. The two, quote, made their entrance into the ballroom to stony silence. An entire table of bejeweled, begloved matrons rose and marched out. The same matrons raised the roof when Barry and Peggy arrived. Barry and Peggy being Barry Goldwater and his wife. When the Republican Party decided that they would rain moral disapproval down on their establishment choice, Nelson Rockefeller, in 1964 because he'd been divorced and then remarried, when they decided that that was too far, that they would not let him survive that, the support of the party had to go somewhere else. And one of the galvanizing arguments that pushed the Republican Party that year to the choice they ultimately made that year, to Barry Goldwater, was this argument. A choice, not an echo. This was published in 1964. It was a clarion call to arms from the social conservative wing of the Republican Party. Are you uncomfortable about Nelson Rockefeller's divorce and remarriage? Well, bring your moral approbation of that sort of thing home to a Republican Party that rejects that sort of thing, that stands for conservative family values, that stands for a rejection of all things moderate, that calls for a renewed, hard-edged, fire and brimstone family values, morally disapproving social conservatism in the Republican Party. It was a call to arms. Phyllis Schlafly. She was a Barry Goldwater supporter. She went to the Republican National Convention in 1964 as a Barry Goldwater delegate. She wrote that book. She self-published that book, making this argument in support of Goldwater's candidacy, a choice, not an echo. Right? Railing against the moderate and morally suspect likes of Nelson Rockefeller, who should never be seen as a real Republican because the Republican Party should reject the likes of him. And hundreds of thousands of copies of that book were distributed that summer of the 1964 Republican Convention. And that's not bad for a self-published book, hundreds of thousands of copies. But the Republican Party liked the argument enough, right, that they picked Barry Goldwater in 1964. They got very worked up about the power of conservatism, uncompromising conservatism within the Republican Party, and they took that to the general election, and they just got taken apart by the Democrats. And whether or not the Republican Party today takes that as a signal lesson about how to conduct general election politics, it undoubtedly established the religious right, and Phyllis Schlafly in particular, within the Republican movement and the conservative movement. It established Phyllis Schlafly and the religious right as a powerful and persistent force in Republican politics. The Barry Goldwater nomination was 1964. By 1972, Phyllis Schlafly had founded a group called Stop ERA, aimed at stopping the Equal Rights Amendment, which had passed both the House and the Senate, was on its way to being ratified by 2/3 of the states, before Phyllis Schlafly's anti-feminist, hardcore conservative activism actually succeeded in stopping the ERA in its tracks. I mean, I think it's almost inarguable at this point that the reason we never got an Equal Rights Amendment in this country, and we still don't have one to this day, is because Phyllis Schlafly stopped it with her conservative activism in the 1970s. In 1975, she changed the name of Stop ERA to the Eagle Forum. Over the years, that group at its various iterations has claimed membership in the tens of thousands. They've got offices or they've got chapters in something like 30 states. They have played a central role in defining social conservatism, anti-gay, anti-feminist, anti-abortion politics, and putting them right at the heart of the Republican Party and its platform. When you look at social issues in the Republican Party over the years, you wonder why the party has sort of refused to ever evolve on those issues, even as the country has. It's not that there haven't been progressive or moderating influences in the Republican Party over the years. It's not like the Republican Party hasn't ever tried to evolve like the rest of the country over the last few decades. Now, what's happened in the Republican Party is that there has been an even stronger force pushing back against those moderating influences to make sure the Republican Party never gets any less conservative on issues like homosexuality, abortion, feminism. And more often than not, that stronger force pushing back to keep things as conservative as they can possibly be, more often than not, that force is named Phyllis Schlafly.
Republican abortion rights activists promised to wage what they call political terrorism until the platform's anti-abortion language is changed. They claim the current platform could cost President Bush the election. Both his likely opponents favor abortion rights.
Are Republican women going to desert and vote for Bill Clinton? I don't think so. I think the integrity factor will keep them from deserting and going to Clinton. Now, will they go to Ross Perot? That's another question. Yes.
Anti-abortion forces, which control the platform committee, adamantly oppose any change.
The millions of Americans who are motivated by high moral principle will not stand for President Bush saying that he is personally pro-life, while the platform is mushed up.
Mushed up. I mentioned earlier that Republican national conventions in modern history have 4 times picked members of the Bush family to be the Republican Party nominee for president. The one of those 4 times that didn't then result in that Bush family member earning a presidential term was that one that you just saw footage of there in 1992, where Phyllis Schlafly happened to be the voice of the Republican Party Platform Committee on NBC Nightly News. I mean, that was the same 1992 convention where Pat Buchanan leveraged his performance in the Republican primaries that year to get himself and Gary Bauer and Ralph Reed and Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and, yes, Phyllis Schlafly all up on stage during that convention, pushing the party to the right, advertising to the nation that the Republican Party had more fire and brimstone to it than your average blacksmith's furnace in a particularly fiery region of hell. And in 1992, just like in 1964, the Phyllis Schlafly influence on the Republican Party, it did pay off in November, but it paid off for the Democrats. The harder the hardliners push, the more success they have, the more repellent the rest of the country finds them. It has not always been a good political move for the Republican Party to follow the Phyllis Schlaflys of the world in terms of their politics and the way they talk about the issues and their fellow Americans, but the Republican Party keeps doing it. And part of the reason why is somebody like Phyllis Schlafly's persistence. She has just been around in Republican politics for so long. I mean, I'm an old person. I just turned 43. But Phyllis Schlafly founded this group that became the Eagle Forum the year before I was born. And she was already 48 years old when she founded it. and she's still running it today. Phyllis Schlafly is going to turn 92 this year, and she is still running the Eagle Forum. And yeah, there have been awkward moments over the years. There have been ups and downs. After her command performance at the 1992 Republican convention, there was a really awkward moment when her eldest son was outed as gay. Right? She's the leading voice of vituperative anti-gay politics in the Republican Party. And then she has to come out and publicly confirm that, yes, her oldest son is gay, but also he works with her and she says he agrees with her on everything, including how anti-gay she is. Well, that was awkward. There was that moment last fall when Phyllis Schlafly and her Eagle Forum put out an excited press release announcing that all of the Republican presidential candidates would be coming to the Eagle Forum's national convention, what they call their Eagle Council. And then in the end, only 4 of the 17 Republican candidates actually showed up. And one of them, Rick Perry, only showed up because he decided that Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Council would be an excellent place to quit the race. The first person to drop out of the Republican presidential race this year dropped out on Phyllis Schlafly's stage. So yeah, there have been ups and downs over the years, but Phyllis Schlafly persists, and she has had a remarkable influence over the course of her long lifetime on the Republican Party. For decades, she has just been remarkably persistent and consistent in the way she has pushed and cajoled and hectored and shoved the Republican Party as far to the right as possible on all social issues. And if everybody else comes and goes, she remains. Until now, after all the other things the Republican Party has been through, what appears to have now torn apart Phyllis Schlafly's 44-year-old organization, what appears to have caused a split not only between her and her organization, but between her and at least some of her own family, is the guy who the Republican Party appears poised to choose this year as their nominee for president.
Here we have the candidate who really will give us a choice, not an echo. So please give a big St. Louis welcome to Donald J. Trump.
Phyllis Schlafly endorsed Donald Trump on March 11th this year. And now apparently, because of that endorsement, Phyllis Schlafly's political world has finally started to fall apart. This weekend, the president of Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum put out this strange notice, which was billed as a hostile takeover alert, saying that a rogue group of board members, a gang of 6, was plotting to secretly force Phyllis Schlafly out of her own organization that she founded 44 years ago. That warning was on Saturday. On Sunday, Phyllis Schlafly herself publicly posted this letter, which she said she wrote, quote, with a heavy heart, demanding the immediate resignation of a majority of the board members of her organization. She was trying to get them to resign before they held this rogue board meeting yesterday, Monday. And then yesterday, Monday, they apparently held their rogue board meeting, and Phyllis Schlafly released yet another statement. Quote, at 2 p.m. today, 6 directors of the Eagle Forum met in an improper, unprecedented phone meeting. I objected to the meeting, and at 2:11 p.m., I was muted from the call. The meeting was invalid under the bylaws, but the attendees purported to pass several motions to wrest control of the organization from me. They are attempting to seize access to our bank accounts, to terminate employees, and to install members of their own gang of 6 to control the bank accounts and all of Eagle Forum. She says, this kind of conduct will not stand. I will fight for Eagle Forum, and I ask all men and women of goodwill to join me in this fight. And then she names the names of what she calls the gang of 6, including one member of the gang of 6 who is her own daughter. So Phyllis Schlafly and her organization, they have been at the heart of the conservative movement inside the Republican Party for over 40 years. And something is happening now to blow it up. Right now, I mean, finally, with Phyllis Schlafly at age 91, after everything she's been through, it appears to be finally blowing up because of Donald Trump. I mean, the Republican Party has been through nominating crises and ideological crises before. It's part of how Poppy Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. It's definitely how Barry Goldwater lost to LBJ in 1964. And Phyllis Schlafly had a role in both of those losses. And we don't know how it's going to work out in the Republican Party's nominating process this year. Today, we learned that House Speaker Paul Ryan will not be riding to the rescue of his party. He said today he wouldn't accept the nomination at the convention in Cleveland, even if they offered it to him. Ted Cruz is still the main not Donald Trump candidate in the Republican Party. A number of Eagle Forum Phyllis Schlafly types not named Phyllis Schlafly have endorsed Ted Cruz, including Phyllis Schlafly's daughter and some of the other members of this gang of six. But Ted Cruz really has no real way to win the nomination ahead of the convention, as Donald Trump continues to not only lead in the race, but to put up mind-bending numbers for the next primary, which happens a week from tonight in New York State. So what happened here in this sort of critical part of the Republican Party's conservative id? And how did a thrice-married New York zillionaire get a Phyllis Schlafly endorsement in the first place anyway?